It's running? Okay. Okay, good morning. Vayishlach Pratis, a journalist called me the other day, and he had heard one of the videos I was doing the last few days about connecting the situation going on in Eretz Yisrael, and especially with the downfall of an overthrow of the Syrian regime. So I was quoting the medrash that's going around from Medrash Rashbi, that Kishanofal Niren Asher B'Mizrach B'Damesek, and they'll fall, and then will come the Geula, and as well as connecting it to these week's parshas. So he wanted me to give him a little more overview, and he wants to write it up because he found it fascinating that events of today can be traced back, their roots all the way, what we call biblical roots, what we would call the Torah. Now, but in general, we don't go look for Midrashim and try to find the Ramazim because there's so many Agaditas. You have to know, what's Shaykh, what's not Shaykh. But being that we can stand on the reliable shoulders of the Rebbe, and Tav Shenun and Nun Aleph, during the Persian Gulf War, the Rebbe quoted the famous Yalkut Shmeini. Today it's famous, and used that as a very direct prediction of the events that were going on then, when Saddam Hussein from Iraq entered into Kuwait, and the Rebbe connected that to a Melech Poras would attack a Melech Arvi, and the world would go and run around all panicking, and then the Yidden will also, what's going to be? And that's when the Eibishter says, the Yalkut Shmeini says, the Eibishter says, Bonei, al tisyaru, don't be afraid. Chol ma she'ya'isa niya'isa b'shvilchem, higiyah zman gulaschem. And the Rebbe quoted this a number of times. And in truth, when you think about events today, it's very similar. You know, who's a Melech Poras? It could be Iraq, it could also be Iran. Actually, Iran is probably more closer to Paras than Iraq. It's that area. And Iran attacking Eretz Yisrael, Iran and its proxies. And then with the fall of Syria, the existing regime, it becomes pretty obvious. It's not about sensationalism, where we just find an interesting medrash or interesting pasuk. There's obviously a deeper story going on here. So I thought I would dedicate this class, because it's Pasha Vayishlach, to what is the deeper story. And this is really based a lot on the Rebbe Sichas back in the Nuns, the early Nuns, and as well as many Medrashim and Maimar Chazal I mentioned a few weeks ago, much more than we know, that actually talk about the events at the end of days. After 9/11, I remember I did a lot of research, and I found from the Rabbeim, the Remez, not so Begoli, where interestingly they talk about, I mentioned the Maimar from Tafshin Tes, which is 1949, right after Israel became a state, whether you recognize that or not, it's not the point, but something happened then. The Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimar, the Pesach Maimarim, talks about the final birur being the birur of Yishmael and Esav. Tafrei Samaches from the Rebbe Rashab, also Pesach Maimarim, that was when the Ottoman Empire fell. So the Rabbeim, as we know, they said Maimarim wasn't always just, they said a Maimar. The Maimarim were often connected to events. We know a Maimar comes to be Mezachich Sa'avir, and there are actually certain Maimarim that was said a number of times, like he brings now Yem Yem. So you start looking, and you find these interesting hints to events in history. I'll just share one interesting zettel note from the Rebbe that I happened to Hashgacha Pratis find back then. Rabbi Zev Wolf Gringlas, Olav Shalom, who was living in Montreal at the time, was from the Atfotska Bachrim, And of course, he was really a Chassidus Yid. They call him a Makubal, but a legitimate one. And if you knew, those that knew him, he was an interesting personality. So he had many exchanges with the Rebbe. You have Igris Kedesh, especially in the early years, you find he asked a lot of questions of Chassidus. The Rebbe answers him barichas. So I found this settle from him to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe answers, Ksav Yad Koche. It looks like from the Ksav Yad around Tovshin Mem. I can't say for sure, but based on my experience with the Rebbe's manuscripts, it looks like the Rebbe's Ksav from those early years, Mem Aleph, maybe. And he asked the Rebbe, there's a Maimer he brings, the Maimer, I think Matzazu, from the Rebbe Marash, Tofreish, Matzazu Tofreish Mem. And the Rebbe Marash writes like this in the Maimer. He writes that Avram Avinu, he's talking about Avram and Yishmael. He writes, Avram hispalel al b'nei Yishmael, lu yichye Yishmael lefonov. The Pasuk says. And then he adds, the Rebbe Marash adds these words, Av sheyoda Avram, ma sheyasi Yishmael b'seif hayomim, or b'achris hayomim, I think b'achris hayomim, still he was mispal for him. So interesting line. What Yishmael will do at the end of days. This is the Rebbe Marash's Heisofer. So he's asking the Rebbe, what is the Rebbe Marash referring to? Remember, Tofresh Mem is 1880. Like the events that's going on today were not 1880. The Arab world didn't even discover oil yet. They were a third world country, and they weren't making that much trouble. So what does it mean after so he asked the Rebbe? And he writes to the Rebbe, maybe it's referring to the Zayar, Seif Pasha Ve'era. And the Rebbe answers, which where there it says that at the end of days, Yishmael will lead Muhammad against Yisrael, and against the West, it says against Edom. Esau basically is the Western countries, and against Yisrael. And then the end will be Yoram Kern Amei, or Yisrael Esachoyel. I don't remember the exact psukim there at the end of Seif Pasha Va'era, and the Geula will come. And there's more details, very interesting details there in this Zohar. And the Rebbe answers him, V're'ei gam Zohar Seif Pasha Balak, which has a similar description like Seif Pasha Va'era, Upiyut Yisrael Nesha, where it says Kila Soyer V'Chesnei. Kiloyim. I think Lashon Kila Soyer V'Chesnei. The third day of Slichus, we say that. What does it mean? It's talking about Kila means Kiloyim. They should be destroyed. Soyer is Edom, is Esav, and Chesnei is his father-in-law, Yishmael. And then the Rebbe adds V'oid. The V'oid I found most interesting because it means there's a lot more. It's not just Amar Mokim here or there. So that right away, makes you think that there's a whole parsha here. Here it is. The Rebbe Marash is writing this. There's a Zohar Seif Pasha. The Rebbe adds Parsha Balak and the Piyut. And interesting that Piyut, just for the record, 9/11 was the second day of Slichus. That next morning was Yisrael Nesha, we say. It's the Yom Gimel de Slichus. So I began looking, of course, the Zohars, and then started finding more and more Ramazim. There's a Maimer from the Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe. I'm not going to go through all the Maimorim right now. There's a Maimer from the Mittler Rebbe, Shari Tshuva, where he talks also a Zohar about what will happen, the Birur of Yishmael, the Birur of Esav, and how they connect, and what the Aveda is. The Abarbanel, which I also, I think, mentioned, the Abarbanel in this Pirush on Daniel, talks barichas, because he also had to deal with both the Muslims and the Christians, and he was in Spain, and there was the wars then. Spain was a Catholic country in 1492, but then it was controlled by the Muslims. It was So basically, Daily Yisrael throughout the generations knew that the two Goliaths, the big two Goliaths that we, Eden, were under, was Goliath Shmuel. I would say Goliath Edom, that's Goliath Esav, and Goliath Shmuel. And there would be ups and downs, who would be And that, you see what's happening. Who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash? Bayis Rome. Rome is Remi. At the end of this week's Pasha, look at the last Rashi. Magdiel, who is one of the children of Esav. Magdiel says Rashi, Zuremi. That's Rome. So Rome is a clear descendant from Esav. And that's why Esav, Edom, we call this last Golos Edom. And then, of course, there's Yishmael. We have to deal with Yishmael. There were the Eden that lived in the countries that Yishmael controlled. Spain, North Africa, obviously Israel. And look at Israel itself. What has been the wars over the last 2,000 years? After Rome controlled it, then the Muslims came a few hundred years later, and they controlled it for hundreds of years. So when you look at the history, you see the constant battles between basically Bnei Esav, Bnei Yishmael, Bnei Esav, and Bnei Yaakov, Bnei Yitzchak Yaakov. So when you look at these medrashim, it's not just happens to be a medrash ahead. It's a pashat ma'aser Rav. You look at history, you can't deny the fact that till this day, these are the battles. Rabbi Avram Shem Tov told me once that he was in Washington, our colleague and cousin. He once said that he was in Washington and they were making then a committee about ethics and morality, Sheva Mitzvah Bnei Neach. I don't remember exactly the name of it. And they called it Judeo-Christian discussion, because the Jews and the Christians have something in common, even though there's plenty not in common. So the Rebbe said to him he should make sure that, why not Muslim? It should be Judeo-Christian and Islam. Which he found like a little surprising, because Muslims were not exactly pro-Israel at the time, or today even for that matter, many of them. But by the Rebbe, if you think about that, what's he saying? But they're also Bnei Yishmael, they also expect Sheva Mitzvah Bnei Neach. The Eibishter by Matan Torah, I'm explaining this, the Rebbe didn't say this. The Eibishter offered the Torah to who? It says to all the Ummis, but mainly it says Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav, because they're still children of Avram, and the birur has to end with them. It's not like we just about eliminating them. I'll talk about this in a few minutes more. So the Rebbe saw that that's the stand. That's what we have to expect from them. They also, especially we know that Rambam paskins that Islam is actually not even not Avodah Zarah. It's Christianity, Shituf. So according to the deist, whether Shituf is mutter by Umm or not, but for Eden for sure not. But Yishmael, the famous letter from the Geras Taman from the Rambam, where, I don't know if you know the whole parsha, but at the time there was a big controversy, the Rambam, because the Muslims who were controlling the Jews in their lands were insisting that in public, even Jews have to follow, they have to respect Islam and they can't practice Judaism in public. The Christians didn't even let them in private. Private they didn't mind, but in public. So some Jews went to mosques and so on. And Rabbonim at the time came out with a big macha, condemning the Jews that are going into a mosque. How could you go into a mosque? A mosque is a place of Avodah Zarah, according to them. And the Rambam wrote a holy snatzlus. They get his Taman. It's one of the big classic letters of the Rambam. It goes down in history, the Rambam as a leader, where he doesn't defend that we have to go into a mosque, but he said, when Yidden are in Dures, it's not Pekuach Nefesh. I mean, it's Pekuach Nefesh the other way, but Avodah Zarah, Pekuach Nefesh is not Deich Avodah Zarah, but it's not Avodah Zarah. There's a whole arichas how Islam is monotheism. It's a belief in one God. So again, it doesn't mean that's what you have to do, but to criticize these Jews that they were ever on Avodah Zarah, Chaz v'Shalom, he's a big limud schus. It's one of these classic letters, worthwhile reading. A big long letter. The Rebbe quotes it quite often about different things. He talks a lot about Geula and other things in this Geras. And we also know that Rambam writes another very radical statement, but in Hilchos Mishnah Teda, Sof Perek Yud Aleph of Hilchos Malachim, which the censor took out. But if you read the whole Rambam today, you look at Rambam La'am or other Rambams that have that nusach as well. It's a whole section where he talks about how Christianity and Islam, despite their flaws, all are liyash. We don't know the status Hashem, and they're liyasher saderech, they paved the way toward the Geula, because they brought the concept of Mashiach and Hashem to all over the world, and Kol Iyeh Hayam, because the fact is, the millions and billions of people that became, that were under the influence of Christians and Muslim, they teach that. This is the Rambam writing, not in a tkufa of democracy, with all the tzaras they were suffering, but he had that foresight. So you don't find it in the regular Rambam because the Christian censors took it out, because there he also obviously criticizes Christianity and why we don't accept Yoshka, etc. And but it's there. Ironically, in Rambam Tfus Remi, that's what it's called, you have the whole text. But it was after Tfus Remi, that's when the censors took it out. But it's there, it's very clear. It's one of the, I would say, pretty radical statement, because I've looked for a mocker for it. There's no medrash or where the Rambam text is from. Sounds like his original idea. There's no Maimar Chazal that says this. But when you think again of the context that I've been describing, you look at the history, at the end of the day, Yishmael was a son of Avraham Avinu. And Esav is a son of Yitzchak and Rivka. So, and as I said, by Matan Torah, the Eibishter offered them the Torah. And there still are characters and they're still playing a big role in the world today. There are 2.5 billion Christians. There's 1.8 billion Muslims. That's like more than half the world. All affected by the teachings that ultimately they took from Torah, with all the distortions and so on, but they still took it from Torah, so they didn't go away. So you have to say there's a bigger story going on here. And I believe that in this week's Parsha, you can really find a big part of the story. Because here we have the reconciliation of Yaakov and Esav. And so what I'm doing here is bringing together a bunch of sichos, and also based on some of these Maimorim that I mentioned and others, to understand what is the true story of Yaakov and Esav. Now you don't even need Chassidus and Pnimis HaTorah to know that Yaakov and Esav were not simple characters. Because the Pasuk says, Beferish, they were already battling within the womb of Rivka, and when she asks why, it's two nations that you carry. It's one of the very interesting psukim, a pasuk that says clearly that these two children, these twins, are two nations. As Rashi brings, the Midrashim bring. So it's a beferish pasuk that you see that Yaakov and Esav are two forces that would be battling both in their lifetime and throughout history. As I said, B'nai Esav, we call it Golus Edom. This last Golus is called Golus Edom. And then, who's in Golus? We are, the Yidden. So the Mechama between them goes far bigger than just their times. But if you really think about it, if you look in the Psukim, what taka was the Mechama between Yaakov and Esav? You're never going to find a pasuk that says, what was the problem? Why were they fighting with each other? So later, the brachas, that Yaakov stole, so to speak, that Esav claimed Yaakov stole, or the brechera, you could say Esav had a taina. But why were they fighting in the womb of Rivka? What was they? So right away, Rashi brings that one represented Avodah Zarah and one represented Gedusha, like the pasuk says afterwards. Yaakov is Ish Tam Yeshiv Ahalim, so he's like the scholar, the godly person. And Esav is Ish Melchama Yedid Tzayid, the warrior. So in Chassidus Taka, Tzemach Tzedek has a big arichas right in the beginning of Tanya. He explains in the Kitzurim Ba'aris on Tanya that Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Abam is essentially Yaakov and Esav. And they're like Zelu Mazeh Salikim, exactly equals, like twins. But they're at war with each other, as the Alter Rebbe explains later in Tanya. That's the Naveda Primus in each one of us. In the so-called archetype, on a global scale, they represent two approaches to life. One is, we'll call it in simple English, the life of war, a warrior, Ish Melchama Yedid Tzayid, which is essentially a materialistic approach to life. And you can even say even further than that it's about who's going to win the war, who's going to win the battle, that life is about survival of the fittest, as is often described. And Yaakov represents, we'll call it in English, a transcendent perspective on life, meaning a life that's driven by what the Eibishter wants of us. Now, Esav was also a son of Rivka and Yitzchak. And Yaakov and Esav Amurim B'Parsha, the Rebbe emphasized in the Parsha, they're both children of Oves Hen Hen Amarkava. But nevertheless, in a way you could say Esav represents the Yesh HaGashmi, the Guf. And Yaakov represents the Neshama, the Oir. And there's going to be a battle between these two forces, between the Neshama and the Guf. The Kavanah is not to destroy the Guf, as the Baal Shem Tov says, Ozev Tazev Yimei. The Kavanah is to be Mavara the Guf. So it's not about Yaakov destroying Esav. That's why you don't ever find that Yaakov went to try to destroy him. He was only, if anything, defending himself. So what does the say about Pasha Vayishlach? So the Maimorim say, the Rebbe brings, and Teireh and more beferish and Teireh Chaim, from the Mittler Rebbe, they write that when Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim, what did he go say? What did he want to see? So Pashtus, he wanted to see whether Esav is going to go to war with him or not. The Rebbeim explains deeper than that. He wanted to see whether Esav was nizbared already. Because he thought, there's two Nushchos in the Maimorim, he thought, one Maimon says that Yaakov thought Esav kvar nizbared. After 20 years that they were apart, that Esav was nizbared. Meaning not just that he would be at peace with Yaakov, that he's ready to go to the Geula. The Rebbe brings his beferish. He brings Rayas from the Medrash. He says, Vahili Sher v'chamer, chamer is a remez and chamer is shal Mashiach. And the Rebbe brings that basically Yaakov thought that maybe, obviously he hoped, but he also believed that Yosef was nizbar. But then when he saw that the Malachim came back, the Shluchim came back and they said that he's going with Arba Me'es Ish, he realized that Esav was not nizbar. So he had to prepare for that. So he prepared for the davened, he prepared for war, and he prepared a bribe to appease him. So thank God the appeasement was good enough, and the tefillah didn't need to go to war. Because in Acharem, once they met, Esav, the two opinions, whether it be Shekeu b'chol libay or not b'chol libay, but bottom line is they reconciled. Esav definitely did not attack, did not hurt him. And Ad Kedei Kach, the pasuk continues that Esav says to Yaakov, now that we have come together and we reconciled, why don't you come? He says to him, come to meet with me and live with me. And that's when Yaakov says, you go ahead, I'll go slowly, because the Saint Rakis, the children are young, the sheep are tender, we're not ready yet. We'll come. Rashi, of course, everyone asks the question, what is what? He's telling him a lie? He knows that he was not going to live with Esav. So Rashi says, Befedish from Medrash again, that he was talking about Losid Lovi. Then Esav was not ready, but this Naloli with time, the Avedis Haberurim, over the generations, ultimately we will, V'haisal Hashem Amlucha, which is essentially the Haftarah of Avadja, who was a Ger, that came from Eden, as the Gemara says, B'nei Bei Abelish de Beinarga, that ultimately they would come together, L'Asad Lovi. That's the story. These weeks. The last sichos that the Rebbe spoke to us, Leisat, in that kufa, this week's Parshas, the Rebbe talks about this in a very, very direct way and says that was then. But today, we're ready in this time of Avedis HaBerurim. And what is the Berurim? Primarily the Berur of Edom. He doesn't talk about Yishmael in these sichos. In other places he does. I'll mention that shortly. So bottom line is that Ad Kedei Kach, that in Vayeshev Nun Beis, which, in my opinion, one of the must-read sichos because it's so fundamental, where the Rebbe speaks about, he actually in the beginning of that Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke in French, because there was a group from France that came to the Farbrengen, that came for that Shabbos. So the Rebbe there speaks about the fact that the Alter Rebbe opposed the war between Russia and France, Alexander of Russia, the Tsar Alexander, and Napoleon Bonaparte from France. So there were Gedolei Yisrael that felt it would be much better for Yidden to live under France, because they promised freedom and fraternity and so on, so it would be easier Begashmis. The Alter Rebbe was of the opinion that even though Begashmis would be easier, but the Nisyanis under a godless France because it was godless. Yes, it was freedom, but without a God would be much worse for the Eden Beruchnis. So a famous story at Rosh Hashanah that year in 8 Tov Kuf Ayin Beis, I think no Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, sorry, 1812, that Rosh Hashanah, the Alter Rebbe got up early and did Tkiyas Shefer before davening. And with the Kavanah, because these Dalim knew that the Kavanas of Tkiyas Shefer, Al Madina's Bay'a'amah, designate the destiny of nations for the year. It was Mechavan, so when there are different opinions who the other Dalim were, but when another Gadol came to blow Shefer in regular time, he said, I think the expression is the Lidvakat Hashem, Arangechapt or something. He realized that's too late. The Alter Rebbe already prevailed in Shamayim that Russia would win the war, which was a surprise because the French were coming on close into Moscow, but it was the cold winters that have not allowed them, and they had to end up losing the war. That year, the Alter Rebbe was nostalgic, and it says clearly in the Beis Rebbe and other places that Rabbeim bring it, that his stalkus was before his time. It was because of Napoleon, because of the, so to speak, the price he paid. All stories with Napoleon and the Alter Rebbe, but the Alter Rebbe saw Napoleon as Shosh Klip Satmeis, like a pare. There's a whole letter in the English Kaddish of the Alter Rebbe and more barichas from the Mittler Rebbe. You could check it out. Very interesting letters about why they were so opposed to Napoleon. He calls him Bonaparte. That's what the Alter Rebbe calls Napoleon. And says that Mamish represents Aniva Afsi Eid. I'm trying to remember all the Lashenis, Liya Eiriv Aniyasasini. Basically the Lashenis of self-worship. He worshipped himself and not God. And he saw that, Alter Rebbe saw that as Mamish Astira to Elikus. So even though Alexander was by no means Erev Yisrael, he was a big Tzeder Yisrael, but not Ad Kedei Kach. You know, we all know that the Baal Shem Tov said he'd prefer a Notzri over an Apokritos. Because an Apokritos, when there's no God, it's far worse than someone that believes. They may not believe exactly the right things, but at least there's some type of acceptance of a higher authority. But without going into all the details, that was then. And then the Rebbe said, "This mamish dover nifla l'ma'ed," unprecedented. You know, the Rabbeim, of course, are all one thing. And the Rebbe said that was then. Today, we can now be Mavader France and the Western world. So I'm moving a portion. I remember right after the Fabrenga, someone asked me, says, so what, the Rebbe is like disagreeing with the Alter Rebbe? I said, no. He's saying that the Alter Rebbe's times, that was the matzav. And the Rebbe compared it to Yaakov and Esav, to this parsha. He said Yaakov thought that Esav was Nizbarer, but he wasn't. But at some point he will be. So the Rebbe said the same idea. Then Esav was not Nizbarer, so Yaakov couldn't go and live with him at peace. There would ultimately be too much conflict between Gashmis and Ruchnis. But today, after all the years, and now the Alter Rebbe is saying, after 7 generations from the Alter Rebbe, Deir Ashvi, the Rebbe brings rayas that the Rabbeim sent shluchim to Tzarfas. He even hints himself and the Rebbetzin that he says they sent, I don't think he said family, there's people who published Chassidus there. The Rebbe talks about in more detail about what happened in Tzarfas, which essentially means that the time of the Alter Rebbe, we weren't ready yet, which makes sense. It's like in many things. It's just like you don't send out a little child out into the street to go be Mavara Berurim. Child first needs to have a chinuch and grow up in a home, and then you're armed with the resources. Then you go out to war. So the same thing here. So now we have the power to transform Tzarfas into Faratzta, which is the same letters. Faratzta, the bracha given to Yaakov, Faratzta Yom V'Kedma. And that's where the Rebbe in Vayishlach Nun Beis also brings what happened in Tov Shin Lamed Dalet. The Rebbe said, that's why, the Rebbe said Chassidim, but we know the Rebbe did it. I remember it myself. I could talk about it, I'm an eyewitness. Tov Shin Lamed Dalet, the night of HaKofis, the Rebbe, I remember, walked out from the bima in the corner, walked out on the table, and began to sing. We heard the words, Haderes V'Amuna, but nobody knew what song it was. Until I think maybe by, I don't remember, somewhere middle, the French guests, remember they were standing on the right, the Rebbe was the corner of Mizrach, was a Mizrach Dorim, right? Yeah, this was like more, they were standing to the right. I remember a bunch of Frenchies, and they recognized finally the song, and they began to sing, and it was what they call the Marseille. It's the French anthem. So today we know it. And the Rebbe sang all the way till the end, till Tiferes, Teilav Tiferes, L'chai Elomin. And now, for the first time in Nun Beis, which is how many years since Lamed Daled? Quite a few years. The Rebbe explained why was it done? Because now we can transform Tzarfas, the anthem of Tzarfas. So even though it's a very aggressive song, and it talks about war and bloodshed, transforming it, like Napoleon's March, same similar idea, be mevared in its tzutzis and transform it to Haderes V'Amunah L'chai Elomin, to the Eibishter. That was what at the time, we didn't know the whole biur, but it was clear that Rebbe was doing something of that nature. But in Nun Beis, the Rebbe explained what he did in Lamed Daled. Just as an aside, which is just maybe interesting, the Rebbe said, Ad Kedei Kach, that once the song was changed to Haderes V'Amunah, it's Yadua, that they changed some of the tenuas and some of the words of the anthem in France. It says, because when Eden are mevared the nitzutz, it affects also the Goyish world, and the song was changed, became a little less violent, a little less aggressive. When we prepared the Sikha, I had the schus to prepare that Sikha. The Rebbe always wanted us to check everything, so I called Rabbi Azimov, Olav Shalom, Shmuel Azimov, the Shliach in France, to just confirm, not Chaz v'Shalom, I had a question, but I just wanted to make sure to know when writing the Sikha, to write the details. When was it changed and what year, etc. And we did research, and he sent me 3 or 4 clips of French newspapers from back in Lamed Hay. In Tosh Lamed Hay, the French government voted to change some of the song in the French anthem. And they had no idea what happened in 770, I don't think. So, but then, unfortunately, in Lamed Vov, a new regime came in France, and they changed it back. So till this day, it's back the way it was originally. So I decided I'll write all this into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked the Rebbe how to write the Sikha, So I sent in actually these clippings, these faxes that I got from France, French newspaper. I didn't read French, but the Rebbe did. And I sent in, and I wrote a note that this is what we discovered, and how should we write up the Sikha. So the Rebbe wrote back that we should write exactly what happened. That in Lamed Hey it was changed, and then it was changed back, and that's that. So we did that. There's a ha'ara you'll see there that speaks about the change. Then the Rebbe wrote to me on the side, which was not for published purposes. He says, what was the Rebbe's lashon? He says, "Ubavade yeh chadosh is gam al piteva," meaning there'll still be changes, there'll still be news even al piteva, which means story is not over. They changed it back, but the Rebbe felt that there'll definitely be more news. I've been waiting since, maybe there'll be news at one day when they change back the anthem. And then the Rebbe wrote, "Aval einin yonem, your inyan is not nachleifen chadoshes. You shouldn't be running after news." I think maybe the Rebbe was, I sent them newspapers. My job is supposed to be writing sichos. Why am I sending newspaper clippings? I mean, but that's what the Rebbe wrote. That's not your inyan to run after the news. Basically, your inyan is to write sichos and spread Chassidus. But listen, sometimes you have to look in the newspaper to write the sikh. The Rebbe was not chaz v'shalom matayin. I didn't see that way. The Rebbe just wrote that as just as a little chayra. So that was that. So you see from this, all of this, and I'll be brief because it's such a fundamental. That's why I wanted to talk about this, because you look at all this. It's not stama ma'aseh here, Yaakov Esav. It's really the story of history. That these two forces, Yaakov and Esav, which is Lumulum Yemotz, has been playing out throughout history, and the Rebbe is saying befedish that now we are. Yaakov thought he was Nizbar and then found out he's not, but now he is. Now the Welt is Nizbar. Now I understand we're still in the Golus and it's not finished yet. We have to open our eyes and all that. But the Rebbe said this clearly, and to Ad Kedei Kach, that he said that what Alter Rebbe opposed the Western world, especially France, and today we can transform it. This is clear. This is not my pshatel. You can read it. The Rebbe says it's befedish, and that's why we are in America. or in France, or in all the Western countries, and we're not afraid now, because we have the strength to be able to be mevared. Like the Frierdiker Rebbe said, America is nicht anders. So we have the power to transform it. So that's the ultimate lesson, obviously, from all of this. So now when we hear these changes in the Middle East, Syria is, of course, we're coming to Chanukah. Who are the Menagdim? Who are the Messiah? The Yevonim? They were not just Greeks. It was called Greco-Syrians. They were Syria. Choron, that we read about. Aram Naharaim is all Syria. This is the place where, there's different opinions where Choron is exactly, but it's very likely it's this area. Definitely that region. So when you hear that falling, I have no doubt, I can't speak for the Rebbe because I don't know what the Rebbe would say today, but based on everything he did say back in the Nuns, it's hard to imagine that the Rebbe would not see the events happening in the Middle East, just like he spoke about Iraq and so on, as being all simonim of the filah, of the Tzatzer Keneged, the Umazeh, in this case Yishmael, and which is a sign, K'shezeh nafal zeh kam, K'shezeh kam zeh naif, that like that brought from the Medrash Rashbi, that when Damascus will fall, Mashiach will come. Similar to the Baal HaTurim at the end of Chayei Sarah, where he says that nafal al pnei echav and Yishmael. She says, and right from there we go to Elatel Yitzchak. Shenafal bnei Yishmael, he says, then will become Telis Yitzchak, which is Mashiach ben David. Look at the Baal HaTurim, the last Baal HaTurim in Parshat Chayei Sarah. Just among, again, many, many different places and sources that talk about it. Everything all right? Somebody fell. So, because of time limits, and a lot more to say, I'll just say is this. Definitely Kedai, you should all look into it as much as you can, because again, we are shluchim of the Rebbe. We have the soldiers of the Rebbe. You talk to people, you want to be able to show them that events that are happening today, if you look at them in the right eyes, you see a bigger picture unfolding, especially the picture of Geula coming. Now again, I'm not looking here sensationalism, here's a medrash and this. We know there's tzaddis and there's hostages and there's wars to be fought. It's not like over yet. But still, when you hear all of this, it gives us a little nechamet, because you get a certain picture that is the story of history. And as I said, Vayishlach Nubei is very fundamental to read. Unbelievable farbrengen. I remember the time when the Rebbe said it, and then now you read it today. And the Mamish puts things into context. So we should be zecher ready, Parashat Vayishlach. There should be the complete reconciliation of Guf and Neshama, Gashmis and Ruchnis, Adira B'Tachtenim, in the Deira Shviyas, the Rebbe promised us, the Deira Achna of Golos, and Deira Rishon of Geula. Everyone have a good day, a good Chedesh HaGeula, good Chedesh Kislev.